Hollywood has always been a factory of illusions. Directors build sets, stunt coordinators choreograph violence, and makeup artists paint scars onto faces that have never actually been cut. But every so often, the camera finds a man who doesn't need any of that machinery. He isn't performing hardship. He's remembering it. Today we're counting down 10 actors whose toughness wasn't manufactured on a soundstage. It was earned in coal mines, prison yards, battlefields, and boxing rings long before anyone ever called them a star. Stick around, because the man at number 2 carried real stone tablets until his shoulders gave out, and the man at number 1 is arguably the most decorated soldier this country has ever produced. Let's get into it. Robert Mitchum built a career out of looking like he didn't care, and for most of his life, that wasn't an act. Raised by a widowed mother during the hardest years of the Great Depression, Mitchum left home as a young teenager and drifted across the country on freight trains, the way thousands of homeless young men did in that era. He worked ditch-digging crews, took shifts in coal mines, and boxed in small-town rings under assumed names just to put a few dollars in his pocket. At one point, while riding the rails through Georgia, he was arrested for vagrancy and sentenced to a local chain gang, an experience he later said taught him more about survival than any acting class ever could. He escaped and kept moving. By the time he arrived in Hollywood, Mitchum already had the face of a man who had lived several hard lives. His broken nose and heavy-lidded eyes weren't the work of a makeup department. They were souvenirs from a rough decade on the road. Fame did nothing to soften his edges. In 1948, at the height of his early stardom, he was arrested for marijuana possession, a scandal that studio executives assumed would end his career overnight. Mitchum didn't panic and didn't grovel. He served his time, walked out of jail, and went right back to work, more popular with audiences than before. When asked to describe his approach to acting, he famously shrugged it off with a line that has followed him ever since. He claimed he only had 2 styles, with a horse and without a horse. It was a joke, but it was also the truth. Mitchum never performed toughness because he had lived it, and the camera could always tell the difference. Long before Charles Bronson became one of the most recognizable faces in action cinema, he was a boy covered in coal dust, working underground in the mines of rural Pennsylvania. Born to a large mining family, one of more than a dozen children, Bronson grew up in genuine poverty, in a household where English wasn't even the first language spoken at the table. As a teenager, he followed his father and older brothers into the mines, spending long shifts hundreds of feet below the surface for wages that barely kept the family fed. That world shaped him more than any drama coach ever would. When World War II broke out, Bronson traded one dangerous environment for another, enlisting in the Army Air Forces and serving as a gunner aboard heavy bombers flying missions over the Pacific. He came home from the war with medals and no interest in comfort. He worked as a bricklayer, a laborer, and whatever else paid the bills before acting ever crossed his mind. That backstory showed up in everything he did on screen. Directors who worked with him often noted that his physicality wasn't choreography, it was muscle memory from a lifetime of manual labor. He didn't need elaborate fight training because his body had already been hardened by mine shafts and cockpit turbulence. Bronson became one of the biggest action stars of his era not because he acted tough, but because toughness was simply the baseline he had grown up with. John Wayne's image as the quintessential American tough guy wasn't built entirely on fiction. Before Hollywood, Wayne worked his way through the University of Southern California on a football scholarship, and when an injury ended his athletic career, he took manual labor jobs on movie lots, hauling props, building sets, doing whatever backbreaking work kept the productions running. Those years gave him the build and the work ethic that would define his screen persona for decades. As his career progressed, Wayne became known for pushing through injuries that would have sidelined most performers. During the filming of The Alamo, he suffered rib injuries performing a stunt and reportedly kept working through the pain rather than delay production. But his real test came in 1964, when doctors diagnosed him with lung cancer and removed a lung along with several ribs. Many assumed his career was finished. Instead, Wayne returned to physically demanding roles within months, refusing to let the surgery define him. Later in his career, he also became one of the many people connected to the production of The Conqueror, a film shot near a Nevada nuclear testing site years earlier, a production that saw an unusually high number of cast and crew members later diagnosed with cancer. Wayne would eventually die of stomach cancer, and while a direct medical link to the filming location has never been definitively proven, the pattern has long haunted discussions of that production. Through all of it, Wayne kept working, kept showing up, and kept insisting on doing as much of his own physical performance as the studios would allow. At just 5'5", James Cagney never had the classic imposing frame of a leading man, but nobody who ever watched him move on screen doubted his toughness for a second. Raised in a rough, working-class stretch of Manhattan, Cagney grew up fighting to survive in neighborhoods where size didn't matter nearly as much as speed and nerve. Those early street lessons never left him. What made Cagney's screen violence so believable wasn't just experience with real fights, it was his formal training as a dancer. Before he became one of the defining tough guy actors of Hollywood's golden age, Cagney worked the vaudeville circuit as a professional hoofer, developing an extraordinary sense of rhythm, balance, and precision. When that dancer's control combined with a street fighter's instincts, the result was a screen presence unlike anyone else's. Punches that looked sharp and economical rather than theatrical, because they were built on real coordination rather than exaggerated performance. Colleagues who worked alongside him often remarked that his movements had a kind of coiled, controlled danger, the sense that violence could erupt at any second and land exactly where intended. Cagney proved, decade after decade, that genuine physical menace has very little to do with height or bulk and everything to do with precision. Anthony Quinn's life began in genuine chaos. Born in Mexico during the height of the Mexican Revolution, his early childhood was marked by upheaval and displacement before his family eventually settled in the working-class neighborhoods of East Los Angeles. Poverty followed him through his boyhood, and by the time he was still a child, he was already working, as a laborer, a butcher's assistant, and eventually as an amateur boxer, trading real punches for real money in the ring long before anyone in Hollywood knew his name. That boxing background gave Quinn a body built for physical roles, and he never shied away from using it. On the set of Zorba the Greek, he insisted on doing much of his own strenuous physical work, including hauling heavy loads that would normally require a full crew, simply because he found the effort more honest than faking it. Later in his career, well into his 40s, he continued performing demanding physical stunts on productions like The Guns of Navarone, brushing off concerns from insurers and producers alike. What separated Quinn from other physically imposing actors was his willingness to be vulnerable on screen at the same time. He could weep, rage, and show real emotional depth without ever losing the sense that he was also fully capable of real physical force if the moment demanded it. That combination came from a life that had already asked both things of him long before the cameras started rolling. Kirk Douglas spent his entire life refusing to be broken by circumstance. Born to poor immigrant parents in upstate New York, he grew up in a household where food security was never guaranteed, and he worked from a young age just to help keep his family afloat. Wrestling became his way out, a brutal, unforgiving sport that rewarded pain tolerance and relentlessness, and Douglas used it to earn his way into college, a path that would have otherwise been closed to him. When World War II arrived, Douglas enlisted in the Navy and served aboard small anti-submarine vessels, some of the most exposed and vulnerable ships in the fleet. He was injured during his service and medically discharged before the war's end, but he carried that same wartime discipline directly into his acting career. On the set of Spartacus, Douglas insisted on training extensively with combat choreographers and performing much of the physical work himself rather than relying on doubles, determined to make the film's battle sequences feel authentic rather than staged. But arguably Douglas's greatest display of toughness came decades after his film career had already made him a legend. In his mid-70s, he survived a helicopter crash that claimed 2 other lives, and he fought his way through a lengthy physical recovery. Then, in his late 70s, he suffered a severe stroke that badly damaged his speech. Rather than retreat from public life, Douglas spent years in grueling therapy relearning how to talk, eventually regaining enough of his voice to write and narrate his own account of the experience. Few actors on this list demonstrated toughness so clearly outside of a film role as Kirk Douglas did simply by refusing to give up on himself. Lee Marvin's quiet, unsettling screen presence wasn't a technique he studied. It was something he carried with him after surviving one of the deadliest theaters of the Second World War. As a young Marine fighting in the Pacific Campaign, Marvin took part in brutal island combat against entrenched Japanese forces. During fighting on Saipan, he was struck by machine gun fire that severely damaged nerves in his lower body, leaving him with a permanent injury that he learned to disguise for the rest of his life, including throughout his acting career. He received the Purple Heart for his wounds and was honorably discharged. That combat experience shaped everything about how Marvin approached his roles. Where other actors studied violence from a distance, Marvin had already lived through the real thing, and it showed in his stillness. Colleagues frequently noted that his menace on screen didn't come from big, theatrical gestures. It came from an unnerving calm, the controlled economy of movement you'd expect from someone who understood exactly how dangerous real violence actually is. He rarely needed to raise his voice to command a scene. Those who worked closely with him often admitted that his presence alone was intimidating, not because he postured or performed aggression, but because everyone sensed, correctly, that there was nothing performative about it at all. Steve McQueen's childhood offered him almost nothing in the way of stability. Abandoned by his father and largely raised apart from his mother, McQueen spent stretches of his youth in reform schools and group homes, developing a rebellious streak that never fully left him. He ran away as a young teenager and drifted through a string of odd jobs and minor scrapes with trouble before eventually enlisting in the Marine Corps, where his defiant streak continued. He was demoted multiple times for disciplinary issues. But when it mattered most, McQueen's character showed through. During a training exercise, he was credited with helping save fellow Marines from a dangerous accident, risking his own safety without hesitation. That same combination of recklessness and reliability defined his entire Hollywood career. McQueen fought studios constantly for the right to perform his own stunts, and largely won. On The Great Escape, the now iconic motorcycle chase was almost entirely his own work, with the exception of one jump the production insisted on handing to a professional for insurance reasons. On other productions, he pushed himself into genuinely dangerous situations, including near-drowning incidents during underwater filming, simply because he refused to let a stand-in do work he felt belonged to him. Off-camera, he raced cars and motorcycles competitively, often under assumed names to keep studios from finding out and shutting it down. Those who worked alongside him on racetracks often said McQueen wasn't just playing the part of a fearless daredevil for the cameras. He genuinely was one, in every part of his life, all the time. Charlton Heston's larger-than-life screen presence in films like The Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur wasn't just costume and staging. It was built on genuine physical endurance that he refused to fake. Before his acting career took off, Heston served in the Army Air Forces during World War II as a radio operator and aerial gunner, an experience that instilled a level of discipline he carried with him for the rest of his life. He rarely spoke about the specifics of his service, but colleagues often noted that his approach to physically demanding roles reflected a kind of quiet military stoicism. He simply didn't complain. That endurance was tested repeatedly throughout his career. For The Ten Commandments, Heston insisted on carrying genuinely heavy stone props through take after take rather than using lightweight film substitutes, leaving him with real, lasting strain on his back and shoulders. During the filming of The Greatest Story Ever Told, he tore ligaments in his shoulder performing a stunt sequence, and rather than halting production, he reportedly had the injury wrapped during a break and returned to finish filming the same day. Like John Wayne, Heston was also connected to the production of The Conqueror, filmed near a former nuclear test site, and he was among the unusually high number of that film's cast and crew who were later diagnosed with cancer. Even after his own diagnosis and treatment, Heston continued taking on physically strenuous roles well into his later years, driven less by ego than by an old-fashioned sense of professional duty. He didn't just play strong, principled men. He insisted on proving, physically, that he could live up to the parts he was given. If there's one name on this list that makes every other story here feel almost modest by comparison, it's Audie Murphy. Long before he ever appeared on a movie screen, Murphy was already the most decorated combat soldier in American history. Enlisting as a teenager after lying about his age, he fought through some of the fiercest campaigns of World War II in Europe. At just 19 years old, during a battle in France, Murphy climbed onto a burning, abandoned tank destroyer and single-handedly held off an advancing enemy company for the better part of an hour, using its mounted machine gun even as the vehicle threatened to explode beneath him, before leading a counterattack that pushed the enemy back. That single act of extraordinary bravery earned him the Medal of Honor, the United States military's highest decoration. But it wasn't an isolated moment. By the time the war ended, Murphy had earned every American military award for valor that existed, along with decorations from French and Belgian allies, an almost unheard-of collection of honors for a man barely into his 20s. What made his story even more striking was his appearance. Standing only around 5'5" and slightly built, Murphy looked nothing like the battlefield legend he had become, which only added to the disbelief people felt when they learned the truth. When Hollywood discovered him after his face appeared on the cover of a national magazine, producers who later adapted his memoir into a film reportedly toned down some of his real wartime actions, worried that audiences simply wouldn't believe them if portrayed accurately. Off the battlefield, Murphy quietly struggled for years with what would today be recognized as post-traumatic stress, a burden he carried largely in private in an era when there was little public understanding of combat trauma. Despite that internal weight, he built a long career in Hollywood westerns and dramas, often gravitating towards smaller, quieter films rather than trading on his war record. Audie Murphy never needed to act tough for a camera. He had already proven, at an age when most people are just starting adulthood, a level of courage that very few human beings will ever be asked to summon. While this list is focused mostly on toughness forged in mid-century mines, battlefields, and boxing rings, one modern actor deserves recognition for a path just as hard one. Danny Trejo spent years cycling in and out of California's prison system as a young man, convicted on charges related to armed robbery and drug offenses. While incarcerated, including time at San Quentin, he became a champion boxer within the prison system, a title earned by fighting some of the toughest inmates in one of the country's most notorious facilities. What makes Trejo's story remarkable isn't just the hardship of those years, it's what came after. He got sober while still behind bars and has maintained that sobriety for decades, eventually working as a drug and alcohol counselor. His unlikely path into acting began almost by accident, when he visited a film set to support a young person he was mentoring through recovery and ended up being noticed for a role himself. Even as his acting career grew, Trejo remained famously grounded about his own limits, often saying in interviews that at his age he'd rather leave dangerous stunt work to professionals who do it for a living, since he had already tested his own physical limits more than enough for one lifetime. In neighborhoods and communities that know his full story, Trejo commands a kind of respect that has nothing to do with box office numbers. It's the respect of people who know the difference between performed toughness and the real thing.